In Genesis chapter 46, we finally get this long awaited reunion with Jacob with his son Joseph that he had thought had been dead for so many years. We now see the family moving to Egypt. Jacob now knows that Joseph is alive, and he said he'll going to go to Egypt and then he'll be able to die a happy man and all of this. And now we see all of the carts that Pharaoh had sent to Jacob and his family there in Canaan. They've loaded up with family, with goods, with livestock, all the thing, and they're bringing everything down to Egypt. Now, on the way, well, we get this really important encounter of God and Jacob there in the first part of chapter 46. It says on the way in and around Beersheba that Jacob offered sacrifice and he worshiped the Lord. And there the Lord spoke to him. And it's interesting what God said to him. Notice he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. It's interesting what he tells Jacob here. First of all, he says, just don't be afraid to go down there, which is interesting because you wonder, well, why might possibly Jacob be afraid to go? They're fleeing a famine. They're fleeing the possibility of starvation and death. They're going to a place where they know they have favor. They know where Joseph is. They know that they'll have food. Why would they be afraid to go down to Egypt? It doesn't tell us exactly why, but a lot of the patriarchs had been down to Egypt before, and typically they'd run into conflicts and difficulties. But I can't help wonder if Jacob wasn't aware of what the Lord had said to his grandfather, Abraham, as recorded back in chapter 15. Now, we got to go way back to where we've been before in chapter 15. But if you remember, God had given a very specific prophecy to Abraham. And it's telling what's about to happen next in the next generations after they go to Egypt, although Egypt is not mentioned in what God said to Abraham. In chapter 15, verses 13 and 14, listen to what the Lord said to Abraham. It says, and the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, Egypt, and will be servants there. They'll be slaves, and they'll be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, Egypt, and afterward they shall come out with a great possession. Isn't that amazing that God had revealed that in sort of a cryptic way to Abram, who became Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, and now we see the beginning of that happening. The family, all of them are moving down to Egypt. And the promise to make Abraham a great nation is going to happen in Egypt. They're going to become a big people, many, many people. That's why eventually a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph is going to enslave them because he's afraid of how large the group of Jewish people have become. And he also tells him there at the beginning of 46 that even though you'll be there, after a while I'm going to bring you out. And we know that that's going to happen. He says also that Joseph will be the one who will close your eyes, a euphemism for death. In other words, you will be with him when you pass away. And so we see that at the beginning, and it's interesting that it's foreshadowing. It's again going back to Genesis 15. It's looking ahead to what is going to be revealed in the book of Exodus, that God is taking them on this detour through Egypt. Now, the next section that you get in chapter 46 is one of those sections you've gotten used to in the book of Genesis, which is a listing of generations, a listing of descendants. And here we get the descendants of Jacob. It's a record. So it catalogs for that is for those who would come behind and read. They would see that. And we get a listing of all of Jacob's sons, but we get them listed according to his wives. First is the sons of Leah, his first wife. Then is listed the sons of Leah's servant, Zilpah. Then we get the two sons of Rachel, and then we get the two sons of Rachel's servant, Bilhah in that order. And it says they total about 70 people directly there from Jacob. That doesn't include in-laws, wives, things like this. So really, it's a much larger group that's settling there in Egypt. And then the last part of the chapter, we see this wonderful reunion. Jacob and Joseph finally come together. We get this just tender narrative of how they fell on each other's necks. You should be used to that expression, hugging each other, weeping with joy, and maybe a bit of sorrow of all the time that they've missed together. But this reunion finally takes place. And then we also see the chapter closing with Joseph in his shrewdness, his wisdom, because he understands that the best place for his large family to settle is in that wonderful, fertile, choice land of Goshen there in the Delta Nile in lower Egypt toward the sea. And he wants to make sure that he can even maneuver Pharaoh into making this decision. So he coaches up his family to say, now, look, when we get to Pharaoh, what we need to do is make sure they understand what you do for a living, what your occupation is, which is shepherding, tending to livestock. Because, and it tells us at the very end, because the Egyptians detested shepherds. It was an abomination to them in my translation, so it means detestable. In other words, the Egyptian aristocracy didn't have a high view of shepherds. They didn't want to be around them. They were dirty. They did dirty work. And so, yeah, let's get them out to Goshen, kind of away from us, and let them do their work out there. So Joseph understands his culture. He's contextualized to it. And he understands how they need to talk to Pharaoh, again, to get the best outcome for the family. And that's where the chapter ends. So we'll leave the story there. We'll pick it up in 47. But just a last thought before we leave 46 is what's so amazing about this chapter is it begins revealing that God is taking his people on this huge detour. You got to remember the big picture is he's promised all the way back to Abram the land of Canaan and to make them a great nation and to bless all the nations of the world through Abraham and the people that would come from him. And now they're going to Egypt and they're going to be there for 400 years. They're going to become slaves. God is going to kind of go silent until he speaks to Moses again to bring them out and begin their deliverance from all of that. But this is an incredible detour that God takes them on. Now, why? Well, we don't really have an answer to that. We get a little bit of that in the book of Exodus because God is going to show his glory. He's going to show his power. He's going to demonstrate that he is God and deliver his people. But in the meantime, this is from a human perspective, a detour that certainly could not have been anticipated. When they went down to Goshen, they were being rescued from the famine. But what happens is they end up staying there for a really long time, and their descendants go through some incredible hardship. So I just wanted to encourage us that sometimes God may take us on a detour. We may think we're going in a certain direction. God has certain plans for us, and all those things might be true. But God still has the prerogative in his sovereignty and his providence to take us on detours for his own glory, for his own purposes, but also that are always intended to help us grow and learn. So if you find yourself on a detour that you might think you're on, have faith. Be encouraged. God has not left you. Remember what he told Jacob, I will go down with you to Egypt. In other words, my presence will still be there with you, even though you're not in the place that ultimately I'm going to take your people to. So no matter where we go, God may take us in a place we may not desire, but God will always be there with us. We are to remain faithful and confident and trusting in him in all things. Glad you joined me. See you right back here next time for chapter 47, and we'll continue our study in Genesis.